What happens when a woman who's been the family doormat for 40 years finally decides to slam the door shut? I'm about to show you exactly what beautiful chaos looks like, and trust me, you're going to love every single second of this story. Before we continue, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let us know where in the world you're watching from in the comments. Now, back to my story. My name is Evelyn, and at 72 years old, I discovered something that changed my entire life. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't what you give, but what you refuse to give anymore. And when I stopped cooking Thanksgiving dinner after 4 decades of being taken for granted, well, let's just say my family got served a meal they'll never forget. But before I tell you about the most satisfying Thanksgiving of my life, you need to understand how I became the family slave in the first place. Because this story isn't just about turkey and cranberry sauce. It's about respect, boundaries, and what happens when you finally decide you're worth more than being everyone's unpaid servant. Picture this. It's a cold October morning, and I'm scrolling through Facebook with my morning coffee, the same routine I've had for years. My arthritic fingers are already aching, reminding me that Thanksgiving is just around the corner, which means my annual month of preparation hell is about to begin. But then I see something that makes my blood run cold and my hands start shaking. There it is, posted by Jessica, my daughter-in-law, for all the world to see. A picture of some fancy Pinterest Thanksgiving spread with the caption, "Looking for inspiration since my mother-in-law's cooking is too traditional and not Instagram-worthy. Time for an upgrade." Grinning face was wet. I stare at that screen until the words blur together. Traditional. Not Instagram-worthy. Time for an upgrade. Each word feels like a slap across my face, but it's the laughing emoji that really twists the knife. She's not just criticizing my cooking, she's mocking 40 years of my life. 40 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 40 Thanksgiving dinners where I've gotten up at 4 in the morning to start prepping a 20-pound turkey. 40 years of hand-rolling pie crusts until my arthritis screams in protest. 40 years of scrubbing cranberry sauce stains off my good china while everyone else collapses on my couch to watch football. And this is how I'm repaid? With public humiliation on social media? But that Facebook post is just the tip of the iceberg, because the real betrayal is about to walk through my front door in the form of a phone call that will change everything. The next morning, my phone rings. It's Brian, my eldest son, and I can already hear that tone in his voice, that condescending sing-song way he talks to me now that he thinks I'm getting old and fragile. "Hey Mom," he starts, and I know immediately that whatever comes next is going to make me want to throw my phone across the room. "Jessica and I were talking, and we think maybe you should simplify this year. You know, you're getting older, and hosting Thanksgiving is a lot of work. Maybe just do a turkey and some basic sides? Nothing fancy. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. Keep it simple?" I want to laugh, but there's nothing funny about this conversation. Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, "Mom, how can we help you?" He didn't say, "Mom, maybe it's time we took over hosting." He didn't even say, "Mom, what do you need from us?" No, he said simplify, which is just code for keep doing all the work, but make it easier for us. I hang up that phone and stand in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I've spent literally decades of my life creating memories for people who can't even be bothered to remember to say thank you. And that's when something inside me snaps. Not breaks, mind you. Snaps. Like a rubber band that's been stretched too far for too long. You want to know what 40 years of being taken for granted looks like? Let me paint you a picture that might sound familiar if you've ever been the designated family caretaker. Every single year, 20-plus people descend on my house like locusts. They arrive empty-handed, expecting a feast that would make professional caterers weep with envy. We're talking homemade everything from scratch, because store-bought is apparently beneath us. Hand-carved turkey, 3 different stuffings, mashed potatoes so smooth they're practically velvet, gravy made from real drippings, not some packet nonsense, cranberry sauce that I make from actual cranberries, not that jellied stuff that jiggles out of a can. And the desserts? Don't even get me started on the desserts. Pumpkin pie, apple pie, pecan pie, and my famous maple walnut tart that takes 6 hours to make properly. All homemade. All perfect. All unappreciated. But here's the kicker, and this is where it gets really infuriating. They don't just eat and leave. Oh no, that would be too simple. They eat, they complain, they criticize, and then they leave me with a disaster zone that looks like a bomb went off in a food factory. Last year, my grandson Tyler had the audacity to tell me my mashed potatoes weren't fluffy enough, while I was standing there literally still wearing oven mitts from pulling his rolls out of the oven. The year before that, Jessica complained that my green bean casserole was too retro and suggested I try something more modern next time. My late husband's brother actually once told me my pie crust was a bit tough while he was on his second slice. And through it all, I smiled. I nodded. I said, I'll try to do better next time. Because that's what good mothers do, right? That's what good women do. We absorb the criticism, we swallow our pride, and we try harder to please people who will never be pleased. But the worst part isn't the complaints or the criticism. The worst part is the cleaning. By the time everyone leaves, my house looks like a war zone. Dishes piled to the ceiling, cranberry sauce ground into my carpet, gravy splattered on my wallpaper, and enough leftovers scattered around to feed a small army. And who cleans it all up while everyone else goes home to digest their feast and watch football? That's right. Me. 72-year-old me, with my arthritic hands and my aching back, scrubbing and washing and putting my house back together until 2 in the morning. Do you know what it's like to spend 3 days cooking for people who spend 30 minutes eating and 0 minutes helping? Do you know what it's like to pour your heart and soul into creating a perfect holiday experience, only to have it dismissed as too traditional or not Instagram-worthy? Let me tell you about the breaking point, because every woman who's ever been taken for granted has one. Mine came wrapped in a memory that hit me like a freight train as I stood in that kitchen, staring at Jessica's Facebook post. It was 3 years ago. My husband had been in the hospital for 2 weeks with complications from his heart surgery. The doctors weren't sure he was going to make it. I was spending 18 hours a day by his bedside, holding his hand, praying he'd wake up, watching machines keep him alive. I was exhausted, terrified, and emotionally shattered. Thanksgiving was 5 days away. Did anyone in my family suggest canceling dinner? Did anyone offer to take over? Did anyone even ask how I was holding up? No. Instead, I got phone calls asking if I needed help picking up anything from the store for Thursday's dinner. Not help cooking. Not help hosting. Help shopping. As if the only challenging part of Thanksgiving dinner is remembering to buy cranberries. So you know what I did? I left my dying husband's bedside, went home, and cooked Thanksgiving dinner for 24 people. I made 3 turkeys because the crowd was bigger that year. I made everything from scratch, just like always. I smiled, I served, I cleaned up, and then I went back to the hospital at midnight to sit with my husband. He died 6 months later, and do you know what my family remembers about that Thanksgiving? Tyler complained that the stuffing was too salty, and Jessica took pictures of the table cape, but criticized my centerpiece as dated. That's when I realized something that should have been obvious decades ago. I wasn't their mother and grandmother and hostess. I was their servant. I was the hired help, except I wasn't getting paid, and I could never quit, and I was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of serving people who wouldn't cross the street to help me if I was on fire. But standing in my kitchen that October morning, reading that Facebook post, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was wisdom. Maybe it was just plain exhaustion from carrying everyone else's expectations for 40 years. But I realized something powerful. I had a choice. I didn't have to keep doing this. I didn't have to keep being the family doormat. I didn't have to keep sacrificing my happiness, my health, and my sanity for people who saw my love as an entitlement rather than a gift. So I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to take back my power, reclaim my self-respect, and show my family exactly what they'd been taking for granted all these years. On October 15th, exactly 1 month before Thanksgiving, I sent a group text that would shake my family to its very core. My hands weren't shaking anymore as I typed those words. They were steady, confident, determined. Family, I've decided not to host Thanksgiving this year. I'll be dining at Rosewood Manor with my friend Dorothy, then catching the 4 p.m. movie. Have a wonderful holiday. Love, Mom. I hit send and then did something I hadn't done in 40 years. I turned off my phone and poured myself a cup of tea. For the first time in months, my shoulders weren't tense. For the first time in years, I wasn't dreading the holidays. For the first time in decades, I was putting myself first. But here's what I didn't expect, and this is where the story gets really interesting. I thought they'd be angry. I thought they'd be upset. I thought they'd guilt-trip me and manipulate me and eventually wear me down until I caved and cooked dinner anyway. I never imagined they'd panic. I never dreamed they'd scramble like ants whose hill had just been kicked over. And I certainly never expected that my simple decision to take care of myself would expose just how dependent they'd become on my servitude. What happened next was better than any revenge I could have planned, more satisfying than any confrontation I could have imagined. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do to people who take you for granted isn't to fight them or argue with them or try to make them understand. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop doing what they expect you to do and let them figure out for themselves what they've lost. But before I tell you about the chaos that ensued, I need you to understand something important. This isn't just my story. This is the story of every woman who's ever been expected to sacrifice herself for everyone else's comfort. This is the story of every mother, grandmother, daughter, and wife who's been told that her worth is measured by how much she gives and how little she asks for in return. You want to know what real power sounds like? It sounds like silence. Complete, absolute, deafening silence. Because when I turned off that phone after sending the most liberating text message of my life, the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. It was the kind of silence that comes right before a storm hits, when the air gets thick and electric, and you know something big is about to happen. But storms don't stay quiet for long, and neither did my family. When I finally turned my phone back on 3 hours later, I had 47 missed calls. 47. In 3 hours. You'd think someone had died, but no, something far worse had happened in their minds. Their personal chef, housekeeper, and emotional punching bag had just gone on strike. The voicemails were a symphony of panic, confusion, and barely contained rage. Let me paint you a picture of just how quickly my family's world crumbled when they realized their safety net had suddenly disappeared. First came Brian's voice, confused and slightly amused, like he was sure I was playing some kind of joke. "Mom, got your text. Very funny. But seriously, what's the plan for Thursday? Should I pick up anything special from the store?" He actually laughed. He laughed because the idea of me not cooking Thanksgiving was so impossible to him that he assumed it had to be humor. But by the fourth message, his tone had shifted completely. "Mom, this isn't funny anymore. Call me back. We need to talk about this." The amusement was gone, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like fear. Then came Jessica's voice, dripping with that passive-aggressive sweetness she'd perfected over the years. "Hi, Mom. I'm sure you're just feeling overwhelmed, which is totally understandable at your age. Don't worry, we'll figure something out. Maybe we can order from that nice deli downtown." Even in her panic, she managed to slip in a dig about my age. Remarkable, really. But it was my youngest son David's message that really showed me how deep their dependency ran. His voice was shaking, actually shaking, as he said, "Mom, you can't be serious. This is Thanksgiving. This is what we do. This is tradition. Where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to eat? You're breaking up our family. Breaking up our family." Because apparently, our family wasn't held together by love, respect, or genuine connection. No, according to David, our family was held together by my willingness to slave away in a kitchen for their benefit. And that's when I realized something that hit me like a lightning bolt. They weren't upset because they'd miss me. They weren't panicked because they valued our time together. They were terrified because they had no idea how to create the experience they'd been taking for granted for 4 decades. Think about that for a moment. 40 years of Thanksgiving dinners, and not one of them had ever paid enough attention to learn how to recreate what I did. They could tell you everything that was wrong with my cooking, but they couldn't tell you how to make it themselves. They were like critics reviewing a restaurant they'd never worked in, judges evaluating a skill they'd never attempted to master. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because their panic wasn't just about one missing meal. Their panic was about the realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd been taking advantage of someone they couldn't afford to lose. Over the next week, I watched my family go through the 5 stages of grief, and let me tell you, it was more entertaining than anything I'd ever seen on television. Stage 1 was denial, and boy, did they commit to it. For the first 3 days, they kept calling with increasingly elaborate solutions that all somehow involved me still doing most of the work. Brian suggested I could just make the turkey and stuffing and they'd handle everything else. Jessica offered to help by bringing store-bought sides, as if heating up pre-made food was some generous contribution. David even suggested I could cook everything at my house, and they'd all come pick it up, completely missing the point that I didn't want to cook at all. But denial only lasts so long when reality keeps knocking on your door, and reality was knocking loud and hard. Because here's what none of them had considered: who was actually going to step up and take my place? Stage 2 is anger, and this is where things got truly ugly. When it became clear that I wasn't going to change my mind, when they realized that their guilt trips and manipulation tactics weren't working, the real feelings started coming out. Brian called me selfish. Can you believe that? After 40 years of selfless service, after decades of putting everyone else's needs before my own, after cooking and cleaning and hosting and never asking for anything in return, he called me selfish for wanting one holiday to myself. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with frustration, "you're being incredibly selfish. What about the grandchildren? What about tradition? You're destroying 40 years of family memories over what? Hurt feelings? You need to get over yourself and think about what's best for the family." What's best for the family? I almost laughed. Because what he really meant was, what's best for me? What's best for him was having a free catered meal in a spotless house with zero effort on his part. What's best for him was maintaining a system where his mother worked herself to exhaustion while he sat on his throne, criticizing her efforts and demanding more. Jessica took a different approach with her anger, choosing the passive-aggressive route she'd mastered so well. She started posting on Facebook about disappointing family changes and when traditions die unexpectedly. She shared articles about the importance of family gatherings and the tragedy of broken holiday customs. She even posted a throwback photo of last year's Thanksgiving table with the caption, "Missing the good old days when families prioritized being together." But my personal favorite was when she shared a meme about ungrateful children abandoning their elderly parents, not realizing the irony that she was the one who'd been ungrateful for years while I was the one trying to establish some boundaries for my own sanity. The anger stage was fascinating to watch because it revealed exactly how they really saw me. I wasn't a person with my own needs and desires. I wasn't someone who deserved respect and appreciation. I was a service provider who was violating her contract by refusing to provide the service they'd come to expect. But anger, like denial, eventually runs its course, especially when the angry person realizes they're fighting a battle they can't win. And that's when stage 3 kicked in, bargaining. Oh, the bargaining phase was something to behold. Suddenly, I was the most important person in the world. Suddenly, they remembered how much they loved me, how much they needed me, how special our Thanksgiving tradition was to them. Brian offered to pay for all the groceries if I'd just cook the meal. Jessica promised she'd help with cleanup if I'd reconsider. David swore he'd make sure everyone thanked me properly this year. They were offering me crumbs and acting like they were generous benefactors granting me favors. But the most telling moment came when Sarah, Brian's wife, called me directly. She'd never called me directly before, always going through Brian for any family communication. But desperation makes people do things they've never done before. "Evelyn," she said, and I could hear the panic in her voice. "Brian told me what's happening, and I completely understand why you're upset. We've all taken you for granted, and that's not fair. But here's the thing, I have no idea how to cook a turkey. I've never made stuffing from scratch. I don't even know what goes in cranberry sauce besides cranberries. If you don't cook, this Thanksgiving is going to be a disaster." And there it was. The truth finally spoken out loud. They didn't want me to cook because they loved me or valued my contribution. They wanted me to cook because they were incompetent, and my competence had enabled their incompetence for so long that they'd never bothered to learn basic life skills. But here's what Sarah said next that really drove the point home. Couldn't you just come over and supervise while I cook? You wouldn't have to do any of the actual work, just tell me what to do and when to do it. Supervise. Like I was a manager overseeing an employee. Like my decades of experience and skill were just instructions that could be followed by anyone with half a brain. She didn't want to learn to cook. She wanted me to cook while she took credit for it. I said no. Again. And again. And again. Because here's what I'd learned in my 72 years on this planet. When people show you who they really are, believe them. And my family had shown me, over and over again, that they saw me as a convenience, not as a person. But the bargaining phase revealed something else, something that both broke my heart and strengthened my resolve. They were so focused on getting me to change my mind that not one of them asked how they could change theirs. Not one of them said, "Mom, how can we make this better for you?" Not one of them offered to host at their house and take on the responsibility themselves. Instead, they kept trying to modify the same broken system that had led to this moment in the first place. They were willing to throw a few more crumbs my way, but they weren't willing to examine why I was hungry for respect in the first place. And that's when I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't just fighting for one holiday. I was fighting for my dignity. I was fighting for the right to be seen as a person rather than a service. I was fighting for every woman who's ever been taken for granted by the people who are supposed to love her most. Stage 4 was depression, and this is where things got really pathetic. When the anger faded and the bargaining failed, when it became clear that I wasn't going to cave to their pressure, they moved into full victim mode. Suddenly, I wasn't just ruining their Thanksgiving. I was destroying their children's memories. I was breaking apart the family. I was being cruel and heartless and unreasonable. They talked about me like I was the villain in this story, completely ignoring the 40 years of evidence that painted a very different picture. Brian started calling other family members, painting himself as the victim of his unreasonable mother. He told anyone who would listen that I was having some kind of breakdown and that he was worried about my mental health. The audacity was breathtaking. I make one decision for myself and suddenly I'm mentally unstable. Jessica ramped up her social media campaign, posting increasingly dramatic messages about family disappointments and broken traditions. She shared photos of previous Thanksgivings with captions like, "When family meant something," and "Grateful for the memories, sad about the changes." But the most manipulative moment came when David showed up at my door with his 8-year-old daughter Emma. He'd coached her to ask me, with tears in her eyes, why Grandma didn't want to have Thanksgiving anymore. That's right. He used his child as a weapon to try to guilt me into submission. He taught his daughter that Grandma was the bad guy because Grandma wanted one day to herself after 40 years of service. Standing there, looking at that little girl's confused face, I realized that David was already teaching her the same toxic lessons he'd learned. He was teaching her that women exist to serve, that boundaries are selfish, that asking for respect is wrong. I knelt down to Emma's level and said, "Sweetheart, Grandma loves you very much, and we're going to have many wonderful Thanksgivings together. But this year, Grandma needs to take care of herself, and that's okay. Sometimes grown-ups need to make changes, even when those changes are hard." Then I looked at David and said something I should have said years ago. "Don't you ever use your daughter to manipulate me again. If you want to have a conversation about this situation, we'll have it like adults. But bringing her into this is unacceptable." He left without another word, but I could see the shock in his eyes. He'd never seen me stand up for myself before. None of them had. For 40 years, I'd absorbed their criticism, accepted their demands, and smiled through their disrespect. The woman who was setting boundaries was a stranger to them. But here's the thing about depression as a manipulation tactic. It only works if the other person feels guilty. And I didn't feel guilty anymore. I felt free. Because while they were wallowing in their victim mentality, while they were trying to guilt-trip me and manipulate me and wear me down, I was doing something I hadn't done in decades. I was planning something just for me. I made my reservation at Rosewood Manor, the nicest restaurant in town. I bought a new dress, something elegant and sophisticated, something that made me feel beautiful instead of invisible. Dorothy and I planned our perfect day, a leisurely lunch, a movie we'd both been wanting to see, maybe some shopping afterward. For the first time in 40 years, I was looking forward to Thanksgiving instead of dreading it. But my family wasn't done with their emotional manipulation campaign. As we moved into the final stage of grief, acceptance, they made one last desperate attempt to break my resolve. 3 days before Thanksgiving, they held what I can only describe as an intervention. Brian, Jessica, David, Sarah, and even my sister-in-law Patricia gathered in my living room for what they called a family meeting, but what was really an ambush designed to overwhelm me with collective pressure. Mom, Brian started, taking on the role of spokesperson. We've been thinking about what you said, and we want you to know that we hear you. We understand that you've been feeling unappreciated, and we're sorry about that. We really are. But here's the telltale sign that they still didn't get it. Everything he said after, but you have to understand that Thanksgiving isn't just about you. It's about all of us. It's about family. It's about tradition. It's about giving the grandchildren the same beautiful memories we had growing up. The same beautiful memories. I almost laughed. Because their memories weren't of helping in the kitchen or learning family recipes or contributing to the family gathering. Their memories were of being served and entertained while someone else did all the work. Jessica chimed in with her perfectly practiced concerned voice. We're worried about you, Mom. This isn't like you. You've always been so giving, so family-oriented. We're concerned that you're making this decision from a place of hurt rather than thinking about what's really best for everyone. What's really best for everyone. There it was again, that phrase that really meant, what's best for us. Because what was best for everyone was maintaining a system where I exhausted myself for their benefit. But it was Patricia who delivered the real knockout punch, the guilt trip designed to end all guilt trips. Evelyn, honey, your mother hosted Thanksgiving for 53 years before she passed. She never complained, never asked for help, never put herself first. She understood that being a mother means sacrifice. She understood that family comes first. I think she'd be really disappointed to see you abandoning the values she raised you with. They brought up my dead mother. They actually invoked my deceased mother to try to shame me into cooking their dinner. The manipulation had reached a level of toxicity that I hadn't even known was possible. But you know what? It backfired spectacularly. Because suddenly I could see my mother's life with perfect clarity, and it wasn't the beautiful sacrifice Patricia was describing. It was a cautionary tale. My mother cooked and cleaned and served for 53 years, and what did she get for it? She got exhaustion. She got taken for granted. She got overlooked and undervalued until the day she died. She never got to eat a meal someone else prepared for her. She never got to be a guest at her own holiday. She never got to experience the joy of being cared for instead of always being the caretaker. Standing there in my living room, surrounded by people who claimed to love me but refused to respect me, I made a decision that would have made my mother proud. I decided to break the cycle. You want to know what my mother would think? I said, my voice steady and clear. I think she'd be proud that I finally learned the lesson she never got the chance to learn. I think she'd be happy that I chose to value myself enough to ask for what I deserve. And I think she'd be disappointed in all of you for trying to use her memory to manipulate me into accepting less than I'm worth. The room fell silent. For the first time in 40 years, they had nothing to say. Because here's what they were finally starting to understand. The woman they'd taken for granted for decades was gone. The doormat who smiled through their criticism and absorbed their demands had been replaced by someone who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to demand it. But even in that moment of triumph, even as I watched their manipulation tactics crumble before their eyes, I knew the real test was still coming. Because it's one thing to stand your ground when people are trying to change your mind. It's another thing entirely to follow through when the consequences start hitting home. In just 2 days, they were going to have to face the reality of their choices. In just 2 days, they were going to discover exactly what they'd lost when they lost me. And in just 2 days, I was going to find out what freedom actually tastes like. Do you want to know what victory tastes like? It tastes like prime rib cooked to perfection by someone else's hands, served on fine china I didn't have to wash, in a dining room I didn't have to clean. But the real flavor of victory? That came from watching everything I'd predicted unfold exactly as I knew it would, while I sat in elegant comfort, finally putting myself first. Thanksgiving morning arrived crisp and cold, the kind of November day that makes you grateful for warm houses and good food. But in two very different locations, two completely different stories were about to unfold. And the contrast between them was going to be more beautiful than anything I could have orchestrated myself. Let me start with my morning, because after 40 years of Thanksgiving hell, I want you to understand what paradise actually looks like. I woke up at 9 a.m. 9 a.m. Not 4 a.m. to start prepping a turkey. Not 6 a.m. to begin the marathon of cooking that would consume my entire day. 9 a.m. naturally, peacefully, like a human being instead of a short-order cook in a family diner that never closed. I took a long, hot bath with lavender salts. I did my hair properly, not the rushed 5-minute fix I usually managed between basting and checking on side dishes. I put on my new dress, the elegant navy blue one with the pearl buttons that made me feel sophisticated instead of invisible. I looked in the mirror and saw something I hadn't seen in years, a woman who was dressed for herself, not for the service of others. Dorothy picked me up at noon in her little red sedan, and we drove to Rosewood Manor like two queens heading to our royal feast. The restaurant was decorated beautifully for the holiday, with autumn flowers and soft lighting that made everything look warm and inviting. We were seated at a table by the window, with real linen napkins and crystal glasses that sparkled in the afternoon light. But here's what struck me most as I settled into my chair and opened the menu: the silence. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of peace. No timers going off. No smoke alarm screaming. No voices calling from the living room asking when dinner would be ready. Just the gentle murmur of other diners enjoying their holidays, and the knowledge that someone else was responsible for creating this perfect experience. I ordered the prime rib, medium rare, with rosemary potatoes and fresh asparagus. Dorothy chose the herb-crusted salmon. We shared a bottle of wine that cost more than I usually spent on groceries for a week, and we didn't feel guilty about it for even a second. Because this wasn't just lunch. This was a celebration of my liberation, a toast to my newfound freedom, a declaration that I was worth being cared for instead of always being the caretaker. And while Dorothy and I were savoring our perfectly prepared meal, laughing until our sides hurt about everything and nothing, my family was discovering exactly what they'd lost when they lost me. But before I tell you about their spectacular disaster, I need you to understand something crucial. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about punishment. This was about natural consequences. For 40 years, I had been the safety net that prevented them from experiencing the reality of their choices. I had been the buffer between their laziness and the consequences of that laziness. And when I removed myself from that equation, reality came crashing down on them like a house of cards in a hurricane. Let me paint you a picture of what was happening at Brian's house while Dorothy and I were dining like civilized human beings. At 11 a.m., exactly 3 hours before our reservation, panic was setting in at the Thompson household. Sarah was standing in her kitchen, staring at a 20-pound frozen turkey that was still solid as a rock because nobody had thought to start thawing it days earlier. Brian was frantically Googling how long to cook turkey while simultaneously calling grocery stores to see if anyone had pre-cooked turkeys available for pickup. Jessica had arrived an hour earlier with her contribution to the meal, a bag of frozen Brussels sprouts, a container of store-bought mashed potatoes that needed to be heated, and a cranberry sauce that looked suspiciously like it had been shaped by a can. She was standing in the living room, taking pictures of the chaos for what I can only assume was going to be another passive-aggressive social media post about family disappointments. David showed up with his wife and daughter, expecting to find the usual feast waiting for them, only to discover that there was no feast, no plan, and no idea how to create either one. His wife took one look at the frozen turkey and the panicked expressions on everyone's faces and did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. She ordered pizza. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how they'd all been so confident that someone would step up? Remember how they'd assumed that the problem would somehow solve itself? Well, reality has a funny way of exposing the gap between assumption and truth. Nobody knew how to cook a turkey. Not one of them. After 40 years of criticizing my cooking, after decades of telling me how I could do it better, not a single member of my family actually knew how to prepare the meal they'd been taking for granted. Sarah tried to follow a recipe she found online, but she'd never dealt with giblets before and didn't know you had to remove them from the cavity. Brian attempted to help by turning the oven to the highest temperature, thinking that would cook the bird faster, not understanding that you'd end up with leather on the outside and raw meat on the inside. Jessica, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated because the scene unfolding in front of her wasn't matching the Pinterest-perfect holiday she'd been envisioning. She kept making suggestions like, can't we just cut it into pieces, and maybe we should have gone to a restaurant, without offering to actually help with any of the work. But the real chaos was yet to come, because cooking the turkey was just the beginning of their problems. Nobody had made stuffing because they'd all assumed someone else would handle it. Nobody had prepared vegetables because that was always my department. Nobody had made gravy because none of them knew that you don't just mix flour and water and hope for the best. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had thought about dessert. By 2 p.m., their Thanksgiving was already a disaster, and they hadn't even gotten the turkey in the oven yet. Meanwhile, Dorothy and I were finishing our exquisite meal, taking our time like civilized people do when they're not rushing to serve others. Our server brought us coffee and the most delicious apple tart I'd ever tasted, made by a professional pastry chef who understood that presentation is just as important as flavor. I pulled out my phone and did something I'd never done before. I took a picture of my meal. Not to make anyone jealous, not to prove a point, but simply to document this moment of pure joy. And then, because I was feeling wonderfully petty, I posted it on Facebook with the caption, "Grateful for friendship, good food, and new traditions. Best Thanksgiving in 40 years. Sparkles." Within minutes, the likes and comments started pouring in. Friends from church telling me how elegant I looked. Former neighbors saying they were inspired by my independence. Women my age sharing their own stories of finally putting themselves first. But the comments that meant the most came from younger women, thanking me for showing them that it's never too late to choose yourself. But while my social media was filling up with support and encouragement, my family's Thanksgiving was descending into complete chaos. At 3 p.m., they finally managed to get the turkey into the oven, but they'd set the temperature too high in their desperation to speed up the process. The outside was browning too fast while the inside remained dangerously undercooked. Sarah was in tears, realizing that she was in way over her head. Brian was getting increasingly frustrated, snapping at everyone who offered suggestions. Jessica had given up entirely and was sitting in the corner, scrolling through her phone and occasionally sighing dramatically. The side dishes weren't faring any better. The frozen Brussels sprouts had been dumped into a pot of boiling water and forgotten until they turned to mush. The store-bought mashed potatoes had been heated in the microwave until they developed a skin on top that looked like something you'd find in a science experiment. The cranberry sauce was still in its can-shaped form, sitting on a plate like a red cylinder of shame. And then, just when things couldn't get any worse, they did. At 4 p.m., exactly when Dorothy and I were settling into our theater seats to watch a romantic comedy, disaster struck at the Thompson house. The smoke alarm went off, shrieking like a banshee and sending everyone into a panic. The turkey was burning. The drippings had overflowed the pan and were creating a smoke cloud that could probably be seen from space. Brian threw open the windows while Sarah tried to wave the smoke away from the alarm with a dish towel. Jessica was recording the whole thing on her phone, probably planning to use it as evidence of her suffering. David's daughter was crying from the noise and confusion. And through it all, the turkey continued to char while remaining raw in the center, a culinary impossibility that they somehow managed to achieve. But here's the beautiful part, the part that made everything worth it. They were finally experiencing the stress, the pressure, and the impossible expectations that I'd been managing alone for 4 decades. They were finally understanding what it felt like to be responsible for creating a perfect experience, while everyone else sat around waiting to be served. And they were failing spectacularly. By 5 p.m., when families across America were sitting down to their traditional feasts, the Thompson Thanksgiving had devolved into complete chaos. The turkey was simultaneously burnt and raw, a feat of culinary destruction that should probably be studied by food scientists. The side dishes ranged from mushy to inedible. There were no dinner rolls because nobody had thought to buy them, let alone bake them from scratch like I always did. But the real kicker? There was no dessert. None. After 40 years of expecting elaborate homemade pies and tarts, they were staring at empty plates and realizing that dessert doesn't just magically appear. It has to be planned, prepared, and perfectly timed, skills that none of them had ever bothered to learn. Meanwhile, Dorothy and I were having the time of our lives at the movies, sharing a bucket of popcorn like a couple of teenagers and laughing at the romantic comedy we'd chosen. For the first time in decades, I was doing exactly what I wanted to do, when I wanted to do it, with someone who appreciated my company without expecting anything from me in return. But the story doesn't end there, because the real consequences of their disastrous Thanksgiving were just beginning to unfold. By Friday morning, 3 members of my family were sick with food poisoning from the undercooked turkey. Brian, David, and Jessica had all spent Thanksgiving night alternating between their beds and their bathrooms, learning the hard way that cooking poultry isn't just about following a recipe, it's about understanding food safety and proper temperatures. Sarah was dealing with the aftermath of hosting a disaster, trying to clean cranberry sauce stains out of her carpet and wondering if the smell of burnt turkey would ever leave her kitchen. The house was a wreck, the family was sick, and everyone was looking for someone to blame. And that's when my phone started ringing again. But this time, the tone was completely different. Gone was the anger, the manipulation, the demands. In its place was something I hadn't heard from my family in years: humility. Brian called first, his voice weak from being sick, but sincere in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child. "Mom," he said, "I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you about 40 years worth of apologies. We had no idea what you were doing for us. We had no idea how hard it was, how much work it took, how much you were sacrificing. We took you completely for granted, and I'm ashamed of how we treated you." Then came David, calling from his own sickbed to tell me something I'd been waiting 4 decades to hear. "Mom, you were right. About everything. We were selfish and ungrateful, and we treated you like hired help instead of like family. You deserved so much better from us, and I'm sorry it took this disaster for us to realize it." Even Jessica called, her voice subdued and genuinely remorseful. "I'm sorry about the Facebook post," she said. "I'm sorry about calling your cooking traditional and not Instagram-worthy. Your cooking was perfect. Your hosting was perfect. You were perfect, and we were horrible." But the most meaningful call came from Sarah, who'd been the one actually trying to replicate what I'd done for so many years. "Evelyn," she said, "I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you managed to make it look so easy when it's actually impossible. I spent one day trying to do what you've done for 40 years, and I failed at every single thing. I have so much respect for you now and so much regret for not appreciating you before." And as I listened to their apologies, as I heard the genuine remorse and newfound understanding in their voices, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: peace. Not the peace of revenge, because this hadn't been about hurting them. Not the peace of vindication, because I'd never needed to prove that I was right. It was the peace of finally being seen, finally being understood, finally being valued for what I'd been giving all along. But here's what I said to each of them, and this is the most important part of the entire story: I forgive you. I love you. And I'm proud that you're finally learning to appreciate what we had. But things are going to be different from now on. Because forgiveness doesn't mean going back to the old way of doing things. Love doesn't mean accepting disrespect. And family doesn't mean one person sacrifices everything while everyone else benefits. When they asked about next year's Thanksgiving, I had my answer ready. Next year, I'm thinking of taking that Thanksgiving cruise Dorothy and I have been talking about. But if you want to host, and you actually want to learn how to appreciate the work that goes into it, I might consider helping. If you ask nicely, if you contribute meaningfully, and if you treat me like a valued family member instead of hired help. And for the first time in 40 years, they said yes to all of my conditions without argument, without negotiation, without trying to minimize what I was asking for. But the real victory wasn't in their apologies or their promises. The real victory was in what I discovered about myself during those few hours of freedom. I discovered that I was worth being cared for. I discovered that my needs mattered as much as anyone else's. I discovered that saying no to what I didn't want was just as important as saying yes to what I did want. And most importantly, I discovered that choosing myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. As I'm telling you this story, it's been 6 months since that Thanksgiving. True to their word, my family has completely transformed how they approach our gatherings. They now take turns hosting. They plan menus together. They cook together, clean together, and actually appreciate the work that goes into creating a beautiful family experience. Last month, for Easter dinner, I was a guest at my own family gathering for the first time in decades. I sat at a beautifully set table that someone else had prepared, eating food that someone else had cooked, having conversations instead of running back and forth to the kitchen. And at the end of the meal, when they all stood up to clear the table and wash the dishes, I stayed seated like the honored guest I finally was. But here's what I want you to understand as we reach the end of the story. This transformation didn't happen because I punished them or hurt them or sought revenge. It happened because I finally stopped enabling their disrespectful behavior and started modeling what self-respect looks like. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who take you for granted is to stop letting them take you for granted. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people who don't appreciate you is to stop doing things that they don't appreciate until they learn to appreciate them. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply choose yourself, knowing that people who truly love you will rise to meet your standards, while people who don't love you will reveal themselves by refusing to try. The chaos that followed my decision to stop cooking Thanksgiving dinner wasn't beautiful because it was destructive. It was beautiful because it was transformative. It was beautiful because it finally showed my family what they'd been taking for granted. It was beautiful because it taught them that love isn't about service, it's about mutual respect and appreciation. Most importantly, it was beautiful because it taught me that I was worth fighting for, even if I had to fight for myself. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. Is there someone in your life who's been taking you for granted? Is there a situation where you've been giving and giving without receiving the respect and appreciation you deserve? Is there a relationship where you've been playing the role of the giver while someone else plays the role of the taker? Because if there is, I want you to know that you have the power to change that dynamic. You have the right to expect better. You have the permission to choose yourself, even when other people don't like that choice. Your story might not involve Thanksgiving dinner, but the principle is the same. When you stop accepting less than you deserve, when you stop enabling other people's disrespectful behavior, when you start modeling self-respect instead of self-sacrifice, you give people the opportunity to rise to your standards or reveal that they were never worthy of your effort in the first place. So here's my challenge to you. Tell me in the comments below about a time when you finally chose yourself over someone else's expectations. Tell me about a moment when you set a boundary that seemed impossible to set. Tell me about what happened when you stopped accepting less than you deserved and started demanding the respect you'd earned. Because your story matters. Your experience matters. And there's someone out there who needs to hear that it's possible to choose yourself without feeling guilty about it. And if you're not ready to share your story yet, if you're still in the phase where you're being taken for granted and you don't know how to change it, hit that like button to let me know you're listening. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about people who found the courage to choose themselves. And ring that notification bell if you want to be reminded that you're worth fighting for, even when you have to fight for yourself. Because the most beautiful chaos isn't the destruction that comes from revenge. It's the transformation that comes from finally knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less than you deserve. Thank you for listening to my story. And thank you for being here.